October 12, 1945, Camp Omori, Japan. The war had ended 28 days earlier, but surrender documents meant nothing to men who had endured 3 years of deliberate starvation. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson stood in the compound's makeshift medical facility watching American medics distribute what should have been humanity's simplest pleasure: a single bottle of Coca-Cola per man, 6.5 ounces of carbonated sweetness that would trigger psychological breakdowns among hardened combat veterans who had survived Bataan, Burma, and the hell ships that transported them to Japanese labor camps. Staff Sergeant Robert Martinez, a former mess hall cook from San Antonio, watched the distribution with professional curiosity that quickly transformed into medical alarm. These weren't men celebrating liberation. They were prisoners experiencing sensory overload that manifested as uncontrollable sobbing, violent shaking, and complete emotional collapse after consuming a beverage that every American child took for granted. The psychological impact of simple, carbonated sugar water was proving more devastating than enemy artillery had ever been. Martinez approached Private First Class James Kowalski, a Detroit factory worker who had been captured on Corregidor in May 1942. 3 years of rice portions measured in tablespoons had reduced the formerly robust assembly line veteran to 89 pounds of walking skeleton, wrapped in diseased skin. His hands trembled as he held the Coca-Cola bottle like fragile crystal, staring at the familiar script with eyes that hadn't seen American consumer products since Pearl Harbor changed everything. The first sip triggered immediate physiological responses that medical personnel hadn't anticipated. Kowalski's pupils dilated as refined sugar flooded neural pathways that had been dormant for 40 months. His metabolism, adapted to starvation rations that barely sustained life, reacted to concentrated sweetness like an engine that had been running on fumes, suddenly receiving high-octane fuel. The carbonation created sensations that his digestive system had forgotten existed, while caffeine stimulated neurotransmitters that had been suppressed by chronic malnutrition. But the physical reaction was nothing compared to the psychological tsunami that followed. Kowalski began weeping uncontrollably, his emaciated frame convulsing with sobs that echoed across the compound. The taste had transported him instantly to his father's corner store in Detroit, where Coca-Cola cost a nickel, and Saturday afternoons stretched endlessly ahead, filled with baseball games and neighborhood friends who probably assumed he was dead. Captain Sarah Wellington, an Army nurse from Philadelphia, documented the reactions with clinical precision that couldn't mask her own emotional distress. 15 years of medical training had prepared her for battlefield trauma, infectious diseases, and surgical emergencies. Nothing had prepared her for witnessing grown men reduced to sobbing children by carbonated beverages that represented everything they had lost and might never recover. Subject exhibits severe emotional response to taste stimulus, she wrote in her medical log. Uncontrolled crying persisting for 12 minutes following initial consumption. Physical tremors indicating neurological overload consistent with sensory deprivation syndrome. The technical language provided professional distance from human suffering that transcended medical categorization. Across the compound, similar scenes were unfolding with mechanical precision. Technical Sergeant Michael Chen, a communications specialist from California's Central Valley, had managed 2 sips before dropping his bottle and retreating to a corner where he rocked back and forth while muttering about his mother's kitchen and Sunday dinners that had become mythological memories during years of surviving on rotten rice and watery soup. The medical staff had expected physical complications from introducing rich foods to starved digestive systems. They had prepared for nutritional rehabilitation protocols that would gradually restore normal metabolic function. They hadn't anticipated that taste itself would become a weapon that shattered psychological defenses more effectively than Japanese interrogation techniques had managed during 3 years of deliberate brutalization. Dr. Howard Brennan, the camp's chief medical officer, observed the Coca-Cola distribution with growing concern about reactions that exceeded his understanding of post-traumatic rehabilitation. 20 years of psychiatric practice had exposed him to every variety of mental trauma that warfare could inflict on human consciousness. But this was different. This was normal American culture destroying men who had survived everything that enemy forces could devise. The carbonation represents more than physical sensation, he noted during his evening rounds. It triggers sensory memories of normalcy that these men haven't experienced since capture. Their psychological adaptation to imprisonment created defensive barriers that civilian stimuli can penetrate more effectively than military therapy protocols. Now, Private Danny O'Sullivan, a Boston longshoreman who had fought in the Philippines, managed to finish half his bottle before experiencing what Wellington classified as acute dissociative episodes. The Irish Catholic kid who had enlisted to see the world found himself transported back to Fenway Park on opening day 1941, sharing Coca-Cola with his brother Patrick, who had died in the Normandy invasion while Danny was building railways for the Japanese war machine. The taste memories created temporal displacement that was more disorienting than physical torture had been. During captivity, O'Sullivan had survived by compartmentalizing his past life into sealed mental containers that couldn't be accessed without triggering complete psychological collapse. The Coca-Cola had blown open those containers simultaneously, flooding his consciousness with memories of a world that might no longer exist. Martinez found himself documenting reactions that challenged everything he understood about human resilience and psychological recovery. These men had endured starvation, disease, brutality, and systematic dehumanization that should have destroyed weaker personalities. They had maintained sanity through 3 years of conditions designed to eliminate hope and human dignity. Yet carbonated sugar water was accomplishing what enemy psychological warfare had failed to achieve. The problem wasn't physical weakness or nutritional deficiency. The problem was that Coca-Cola represented American normalcy in its purest form. Every bottle contained concentrated essence of the civilization these men had fought to defend and might never experience again. The taste triggered recognition of how fundamentally they had been changed by experiences that couldn't be shared with people who had never questioned whether they would survive the next 24 hours. Wellington's medical reports documented physiological responses that revealed the neurological cost of survival under extreme conditions. Blood pressure spikes, irregular heartbeat, hyperventilation, and tremors indicated that the prisoners' nervous systems had adapted to constant stress in ways that made peaceful stimuli more threatening than combat had ever been. Their brains had rewired themselves for survival in hell, making heaven neurologically dangerous. The sweetness triggered insulin responses that created hypoglycemic episodes in men whose pancreatic function had adapted to starvation rations. The caffeine stimulated cardiovascular systems that had learned to operate at minimum capacity. Most significantly, the taste activated memory centers that had been deliberately suppressed to maintain psychological equilibrium under impossible conditions. As evening fell across Camp Omori, the medical staff compiled reports that would travel to Washington offices where policymakers were designing rehabilitation programs based on assumptions about human psychology that the Coca-Cola distribution had systematically demolished. These weren't broken men who needed simple medical treatment. These were fundamentally altered human beings who had survived by becoming something that normal society couldn't accommodate or understand. The bottle sat empty across the compound like evidence of an experiment that had revealed uncomfortable truths about the price of survival and the impossibility of returning to innocence once certain experiences had rewired human consciousness at the cellular level. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as medical personnel attempted to bridge the gap between what these men had become and what American society expected them to resume being. October 13th, 1945. The morning after Coca-Cola had triggered psychological earthquakes across Camp Omori, Dr. Brennan found himself facing a medical crisis that no textbook had prepared him to handle. The distribution of carbonated beverages had created more casualties than the previous week of routine medical care combined. 47 former prisoners required individual psychological evaluation after experiencing complete emotional breakdowns triggered by 6.5 ounces of American normalcy. Corporal Eddie Ramirez, a former aircraft mechanic from Phoenix, hadn't spoken since consuming his Coca-Cola 18 hours earlier. The man who had survived the Bataan death march and 2 years of forced labor in Japanese copper mines sat motionless in the medical tent, staring at his empty bottle with the fixed concentration of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. His silence wasn't shock or trauma in any conventional medical sense. It was the profound disorientation of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had been shattered by familiar taste. Wellington approached with the careful precision of a nurse who had learned to read psychological distress through subtle physical indicators. Ramirez's breathing patterns, muscle tension, and eye movement suggested cognitive processing overload rather than standard post-traumatic stress responses. His brain was attempting to reconcile 3 years of survival-focused neural adaptation with sensory input that belonged to a world he had been forced to abandon. The taste triggered memories of Saturday nights at the Maricopa County Fair, sharing Coca-Cola with Maria Santos, the girl he had planned to marry before December 7th, 1941, transformed personal dreams into military obligations. Those memories had been deliberately suppressed during captivity because homesickness was a luxury that starving men couldn't afford. Now they flooded back with overwhelming intensity that threatened psychological equilibrium he had maintained through deliberate emotional numbness. Martinez discovered similar patterns throughout the compound as he conducted morning rounds that revealed the systematic nature of Coca-Cola's psychological assault on men who had survived by compartmentalizing their humanity. Technical Sergeant Frank Kowalski, no relation to the Detroit factory worker, had managed to drink his entire bottle before experiencing what appeared to be temporal displacement episodes that transported him to his childhood in Milwaukee, where his Polish grandmother served Coca-Cola as special treats during Sunday family dinners. The problem wasn't nostalgia or homesickness in any recognizable form. The problem was that these men had survived imprisonment by creating psychological barriers between their current existence and their pre-war identities. They had become different people entirely, adapted to conditions that required suppressing every memory of comfort, pleasure, or normal human experience. The Coca-Cola had demolished those barriers instantly, flooding their consciousness with incompatible versions of themselves. Dr. Brennan's clinical observations revealed neurological responses that challenged conventional understanding of psychological adaptation and recovery. The prisoners weren't simply remembering better times. They were experiencing profound cognitive dissonance as their adapted survival personalities encountered sensory input that belonged to their original civilian identities. The conflict between these incompatible psychological states was creating breakdown symptoms that exceeded traditional trauma treatment protocols. The carbonation itself had become a neurological trigger that activated dormant neural pathways associated with peacetime experiences. During 3 years of captivity, these men had learned to find sustenance in rice water and vegetable scraps that bore no resemblance to American food culture. Their taste receptors had adapted to detect nutrition in substances that would have been inedible during civilian life. The sudden reintroduction of familiar flavors created sensory confusion that manifested as psychological crisis. Sergeant Major Thomas Patterson, a career soldier from Georgia who had been captured in Java, experienced delayed reaction that began 6 hours after consumption and continued throughout the night. The professional military man who had maintained discipline and morale among fellow prisoners through systematic brutality found himself sobbing uncontrollably while describing his grandfather's general store, where Coca-Cola advertisements promised happiness and refreshment that had become impossible concepts during years of survival. Wellington's documentation revealed patterns that extended beyond individual trauma into collective psychological phenomena affecting the entire prisoner population. The Coca-Cola distribution had created a shared crisis that connected men who had survived by maintaining emotional isolation from each other. Their simultaneous breakdown created community recognition of how fundamentally they had been changed by experiences that couldn't be communicated to people who had never questioned basic assumptions about human dignity and physical security. The medical staff found themselves treating symptoms that had no established protocols or therapeutic frameworks. These weren't battle fatigue cases or shell shock victims who could be rehabilitated through rest and gradual reintegration. These were men who had been psychologically reconstructed by extreme conditions and were now experiencing identity crisis triggered by simple consumer products that represented everything they had lost and might never be able to recover. Captain Robert Sterling, a former insurance salesman from Chicago who had been captured on Wake Island, managed to articulate what many prisoners couldn't express through conventional language. The taste didn't just remind him of home, it reminded him of who he used to be before survival required abandoning every aspect of his original personality. The Coca-Cola had forced him to confront the reality that the person who had enjoyed carbonated beverages no longer existed, except as traumatic memory. Martinez realized they were witnessing psychological archaeology, as suppressed memories surfaced with archaeological precision, revealing layers of buried experience that had been deliberately forgotten to maintain sanity under impossible conditions. Each sip had excavated deeper levels of pre-war identity that conflicted with survival adaptations these men had developed to remain alive when death would have been easier than continued existence. The sweetness triggered physiological responses that exceeded simple blood sugar fluctuations. These men had learned to survive on starvation rations that trained their metabolisms to extract maximum nutrition from minimal input. The sudden introduction of concentrated sugar created metabolic shock that combined with neurological overload to produce symptoms that resembled drug overdose more than nutritional rehabilitation. Brennan's evening reports to military command revealed the scope of therapeutic challenges that would face rehabilitation programs designed by officials who had never experienced conditions that required fundamental personality reconstruction. Standard psychiatric treatment assumed continuity of identity that these men had been forced to abandon. The Coca-Cola had revealed that recovery would require rebuilding human personalities from psychological foundations that had been systematically demolished by survival requirements. As the second night fell across Camp Omori, the medical staff prepared for continued psychological crisis management that would determine whether these men could ever successfully transition from survival-adapted prisoners back to functioning members of American society. The empty Coca-Cola bottles remained as evidence of an unintentional experiment that had exposed the true cost of survival and the complexity of human psychological adaptation under extreme duress that exceeded medical understanding of trauma and recovery. October 14th, 1945. Camp Omori's medical facility had become a psychological laboratory where American military medicine confronted evidence that challenged every assumption about human adaptability and recovery. Dr. Brennan stood before a collection of empty Coca-Cola bottles that had accomplished what 3 years of Japanese psychological warfare had failed to achieve: the systematic destruction of 200 combat veterans through carbonated sugar water that represented everything their survival had required them to forget. Sergeant First Class Anthony DeMarco, a former construction worker from Brooklyn who had built airfields under Japanese supervision, sat in the corner of the medical tent methodically tearing labels from his empty bottle with the obsessive precision of someone whose mind had fractured along invisible fault lines. His hands moved with mechanical repetition while his eyes remained fixed on middle distance that contained memories too dangerous to fully acknowledge. The Italian-American who had survived the Burma Railway by focusing exclusively on the next shovel of dirt, the next rail spike, the next 12 hours of existence, found himself transported to Coney Island on Labor Day, 1940. The taste had unlocked sensory memories of Nathan's hot dogs, carnival games, and sharing Coca-Cola with his younger brother Sal, who had died somewhere in the Pacific while DeMarco was digging Japanese supply tunnels through monsoon-soaked mountains. Wellington's clinical observations documented responses that exceeded conventional psychiatric categories. DeMarco wasn't experiencing flashbacks or hallucinations in any recognizable form. He was living simultaneously in two incompatible realities that his consciousness couldn't reconcile. The construction worker who had learned to find meaning in forced labor existed alongside the brother who had once believed happiness could be purchased for a nickel at a soda fountain. The psychological architecture that had enabled survival was crumbling under assault from memories that belonged to someone he could no longer afford to be. During captivity, DeMarco had maintained sanity by creating internal barriers between his current existence and his pre-war identity. Those barriers had become load-bearing structures in his psychological framework. The Coca-Cola had demolished them without providing alternative support systems for consciousness that could no longer function according to its original specifications. Martinez discovered similar patterns among prisoners who had managed their second night without complete breakdown, but showed symptoms that indicated ongoing neurological crisis. Private First Class William Chen, the communications specialist whose family had operated a restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown, exhibited what appeared to be selective memory dysfunction that allowed him to remember technical military procedures while blocking access to any recollection of civilian comfort or family relationships. The taste had created cognitive fragmentation that separated his professional identity from personal history in ways that protected essential functions while sacrificing emotional continuity. Chen could recite radio frequencies and encryption protocols with perfect accuracy, but couldn't remember his mother's face or recall the sensation of eating food that hadn't been deliberately contaminated by captors who used nutrition as psychological weapon. Dr. Brennan's documentation revealed systematic patterns that suggested the Coca-Cola distribution had triggered predictable neurological responses rather than random psychological breakdowns. The prisoners weren't experiencing individual trauma reactions. They were demonstrating collective evidence of how human consciousness adapted to extreme conditions by sacrificing non-essential psychological functions to maintain biological survival. The carbonation had reactivated sensory pathways that had been deliberately suppressed during adaptation to imprisonment. These men had learned to survive by eliminating emotional responses to comfort, pleasure, or hope, because such responses represented dangerous vulnerabilities that could be exploited by captors who understood that psychological destruction was more effective than physical brutality for maintaining control over populations that outnumbered their guards. Corporal Jack Morrison, a former farmer from Nebraska who had been captured in Java, experienced delayed onset symptoms that began 48 hours after consumption and manifested as complete inability to distinguish between past and present experiences. The man who had maintained agricultural knowledge that helped fellow prisoners supplement their diet with edible plants found himself harvesting corn in his father's fields while simultaneously sitting in a Japanese prison camp medical facility. The temporal displacement wasn't hallucination or delusional thinking in any clinical sense. It was evidence of how survival had required Morrison to compartmentalize different aspects of his identity into separate psychological containers that prevented cross-contamination between hope and reality. The Coca-Cola had caused those containers to rupture simultaneously, creating consciousness that existed in multiple time periods without coherent integration. Wellington's nursing experience provided framework for understanding symptoms that exceeded medical school training about trauma recovery and psychological rehabilitation. These men weren't suffering from battle fatigue or combat stress that could be treated through rest and gradual reintegration into normal military routine. They were experiencing fundamental identity crisis caused by sensory input that belonged to people they had been forced to stop being in order to remain alive. The sweetness triggered physiological cascades that revealed how starvation had rewired their neurological responses to food, pleasure, and comfort. Their brains had learned to interpret any positive sensory experience as dangerous delusion that could undermine the constant vigilance required for survival. The Coca-Cola had forced recognition that they were no longer equipped to function in environments where pleasure existed without immediate threat of its removal. Staff Sergeant Robert Kim, a Japanese-American soldier from California who had experienced double trauma of imprisonment and racial persecution, articulated what many prisoners couldn't verbalize about their psychological fragmentation. The taste hadn't reminded him of better times. It had reminded him that better times existed in a world where he was no longer capable of participating without experiencing panic responses that had kept him alive under conditions designed to eliminate hope. Martinez realized they were documenting evidence of human psychological adaptation that exceeded existing understanding of mental resilience and recovery potential. These men had survived by becoming fundamentally different people who possessed skills and psychological structures that were incompatible with peacetime existence. The Coca-Cola had revealed that returning to their original identities wasn't simply difficult, it was neurologically impossible without complete personality reconstruction. The medical staff found themselves treating symptoms that had no established therapeutic protocols, because military medicine had never encountered patients who had survived by abandoning every aspect of their original psychological architecture. Traditional treatment assumed continuity of identity that could be restored through appropriate intervention. These men had achieved survival through identity destruction that couldn't be reversed through conventional psychiatric methods. Dr. Brennan's reports to military command revealed the scope of rehabilitation challenges that would face post-war medical systems unprepared for patients who had survived by becoming psychologically incompatible with the society they had fought to defend. The Coca-Cola distribution had provided accidental insight into how extreme trauma created adaptive changes that enabled survival while preventing recovery according to normal definitions of psychological health. As Camp Omori entered its third day of managing Coca-Cola-induced psychological crisis, the medical staff prepared comprehensive documentation that would influence military medicine's understanding of survival trauma and recovery limitations. The empty bottles remained as evidence that human consciousness could adapt to conditions that exceeded the boundaries of experience that peacetime psychology could accommodate or treat through existing therapeutic frameworks. The implications extended beyond individual patient care into strategic questions about how American society would integrate veterans whose survival had required abandoning the psychological characteristics that defined normal citizenship. The Coca-Cola experiment had revealed that winning the war was only the beginning of challenges that would test whether democracy could accommodate people who had been forced to transcend human limitations that civilian populations had never been required to exceed. October 15th, 1945. The third morning after what military personnel were privately calling the Coca-Cola incident found Dr. Brennan confronting medical realities that challenged fundamental assumptions about human psychological recovery. The compound's makeshift psychiatric ward had filled with men whose breakdown symptoms defied conventional treatment protocols, creating a crisis that exposed gaps in military medicine's understanding of extreme survival adaptation. Technical Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, a former Detroit tool and die maker who had survived the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, sat motionless beside his hospital cot, methodically arranging and rearranging small stones he had collected from the compound's gravel paths. His movements possessed the mechanical precision of factory work, but his eyes held the distant focus of someone whose consciousness existed in multiple locations simultaneously. The taste had transported Kowalski to his father's machine shop on Michigan Avenue, where Saturday mornings meant learning precision metalwork while sharing Coca-Cola during lunch breaks that stretched into afternoon conversations about craftsmanship and American industrial pride. Those memories belonged to someone who had believed that skill and hard work guaranteed dignity and security. 3 years of forced labor under Japanese supervision had systematically demolished those beliefs through daily demonstrations that human value could be reduced to caloric output and replacement cost calculations. Wellington approached with documentation that revealed patterns emerging across the entire prisoner population. The Coca-Cola reactions weren't random psychological breakdowns. They were systematic responses that indicated how survival under extreme conditions had required fundamental alterations to human consciousness that peacetime medicine was unprepared to address or reverse. Subject exhibits compartmentalized memory function that allows access to technical knowledge while blocking emotional recollections associated with civilian identity, she wrote in her clinical notes. Survival adaptation appears to have created psychological barriers that protect essential functions by sacrificing non-essential human experiences, including family bonds, personal relationships, and cultural attachments that could compromise survival focus. Across the medical facility, Private First Class Joseph Santos, a former fisherman from Massachusetts who had been captured in the Philippines, demonstrated symptoms that revealed the neurological cost of maintaining hope under hopeless conditions. The Portuguese-American who had spent 3 years building Japanese airfields while mentally designing fishing boat modifications that would never be constructed, found himself experiencing temporal displacement that transported him to Gloucester Harbour on summer evenings when the fleet returned with holds full of cod and optimism. The sensory memory of carbonation had triggered recognition of how completely he had been forced to abandon the person who had once found meaning in honest work, family traditions, and community relationships that connected individual identity to larger cultural purposes. Santos had survived by becoming someone who could extract nutrition from rotten rice while planning escape routes that would never be attempted because successful survival required accepting imprisonment as permanent condition rather than temporary setback. Martinez documented reactions that revealed systematic patterns of psychological adaptation that enabled survival while preventing recovery according to normal definitions of mental health. These men had learned to function without access to emotional responses that civilian populations considered essential aspects of human experience. Hope, joy, anticipation, and comfort had become dangerous luxuries that could undermine the constant vigilance required for staying alive when death represented relief rather than tragedy. The carbonated sweetness had forced recognition that they were no longer equipped to experience pleasure without immediate anxiety about its removal. During captivity, any positive sensation had been followed by deliberate infliction of pain or deprivation that taught prisoners to associate comfort with impending punishment. Their nervous systems had adapted by creating automatic stress responses to pleasant stimuli that protected them from psychological devastation when comfort was inevitably withdrawn. Dr. Brennan's morning rounds revealed the scope of therapeutic challenges that exceeded existing psychiatric frameworks for treating combat trauma or prisoner rehabilitation. Corporal Michael Petrov, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh who had survived Japanese labor camps by maintaining detailed mental inventories of American industrial processes, experienced what appeared to be selective amnesia that preserved technical knowledge while blocking access to any memory of personal relationships or civilian comfort. The Russian-American who could recite blast furnace operating procedures with perfect accuracy couldn't remember his wife's name or recall the taste of his mother's cooking without triggering panic responses that had kept him alive when emotional attachments represented vulnerabilities that captors could exploit for psychological control. His survival had required systematic elimination of human connections that gave life meaning beyond mere biological continuation. Wellington's clinical observations documented neurological responses that suggested these men had achieved survival through adaptive changes that were irreversible through conventional treatment methods. Their brains had rewired themselves to prioritize threat detection and resource conservation over emotional processing and social bonding. The Coca-Cola had revealed that returning to normal civilian function would require rebuilding psychological architecture from foundations that had been deliberately destroyed to enable survival under conditions that exceeded human design specifications. Staff Sergeant David Kim, no relation to the Japanese-American prisoner, had managed his third day without complete breakdown, but exhibited symptoms that indicated ongoing cognitive fragmentation. The former machinist from Ohio, who had maintained precision measurement skills throughout 3 years of forced construction work, found himself unable to distinguish between mechanical procedures and human relationships, treating both with identical emotional detachment that had enabled survival but prevented normal social function. The taste had triggered recognition of how survival had required him to view other prisoners as mechanical components rather than human beings whose suffering might compromise his ability to maintain focus on staying alive. Emotional connections had become operational liabilities that reduced efficiency and increased vulnerability to psychological manipulation by captors who understood that caring about others created opportunities for inflicting pain that transcended physical torture. Martinez realized they were witnessing evidence of human adaptability that revealed uncomfortable truths about the relationship between survival and humanity. These men had remained alive by abandoning psychological characteristics that civilian populations considered essential aspects of human nature. They had become efficient survival machines who possessed technical competence while sacrificing emotional capacity that made existence meaningful rather than merely biological. The medical staff found themselves treating patients who had achieved the ultimate military objective of staying alive and maintaining operational capability under impossible conditions, but who were no longer psychologically equipped to function in the peaceful society they had fought to defend. Their success as survivors had created adaptive changes that made them incompatible with normal human relationships, civilian employment, and social integration that required emotional responses they had learned to suppress. Dr. Brennan's documentation revealed patterns that would influence post-war psychiatric treatment for decades, as military medicine confronted evidence that extreme survival could require psychological changes that prevented recovery, according to traditional definitions of mental health. The Coca-Cola distribution had provided accidental insight into how human consciousness adapted to conditions that exceeded the boundaries of experience that peacetime psychology could understand or address through existing therapeutic methods. Captain Harrison Wells, a former teacher from Vermont who had maintained educational programs among fellow prisoners, articulated what many couldn't express about their psychological transformation. The taste hadn't triggered nostalgia or homesickness. It had forced recognition that the person who had once enjoyed simple pleasures no longer existed except as dangerous memory that could undermine survival adaptations that had kept him alive when hope would have been fatal weakness. The educational professional who had learned to find meaning in teaching fellow prisoners practical skills for surviving starvation and disease found himself unable to remember why education had once seemed important when knowledge served no purpose except enabling more efficient exploitation by captors who viewed human intelligence as resource to be extracted rather than capacity to be developed. Wellington's evening reports documented systematic evidence that survival under extreme conditions required abandoning aspects of human identity that civilian populations assumed were indestructible components of personality and character. These men had achieved survival by becoming fundamentally different people, whose psychological architecture was incompatible with peacetime existence that demanded emotional responses they were no longer capable of experiencing without triggering defensive mechanisms designed for staying alive under constant threat. As Camp Omori entered its fourth night of managing ongoing psychological crisis, the medical staff prepared comprehensive analysis that would challenge military medicine's understanding of human adaptability and recovery limitations. The empty Coca-Cola bottles remained as evidence that victory in war was only the beginning of challenges that would test whether American society could accommodate veterans whose survival had required transcending normal human psychological boundaries in ways that prevented return to civilian identity, according to conventional definitions of successful rehabilitation and social reintegration. The reports from Camp Omori would travel to Washington offices where officials were designing rehabilitation programs based on assumptions about human psychology that 3 days of Coca-Cola distribution had systematically demolished. Dr. Brennan's documentation revealed that these 200 former prisoners represented something unprecedented in military medicine. Men who had achieved the ultimate objective of staying alive under conditions designed to eliminate human dignity, but whose success had required psychological transformations that made them incompatible with the society they had fought to defend. The empty bottles scattered across the compound bore witness to an accidental experiment that exposed uncomfortable truths about the price of survival. These weren't broken men who needed simple medical treatment. They were fundamentally altered human beings who had transcended normal psychological limitations through adaptive changes that enabled survival while preventing recovery according to conventional definitions of mental health and social integration. As American forces prepared to bring these veterans home, military medicine confronted evidence that winning the war was only the beginning of challenges that would test whether democracy could accommodate people whose survival had required abandoning the psychological characteristics that defined normal citizenship. The carbonated sweetness that every American child took for granted had revealed that some victories came at costs that exceeded the boundaries of what peacetime society could understand, treat, or ultimately accept.